I moved into my dream house thinking I'd finally made it. Years of saving, planning, sacrificing weekend after weekend for overtime, and it had all led me here. A charming two-story brick home with a wraparound porch and a yard big enough to breathe. The kind of place you picture kids playing in, dogs running free, and summer barbecues with neighbors you actually like. It was nestled at the edge of a tidy little cul-de-sac, with manicured lawns and tree-lined streets. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could happen. When I first stepped into that house, I remember the way the sunlight hit the hardwood floors, how the kitchen cabinet smelled faintly of lemon oil, and the stillness that made it feel like the world had finally stopped spinning so fast. It wasn't just a house, it was peace. I unpacked my boxes with a kind of quiet joy I hadn't felt in years. The stress of moving melted away as I arranged bookshelves, hung up pictures, and planted some perennials out front. For the first time in forever, I exhaled. I was home. That illusion lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, I got a letter. No stamp, no envelope, just a folded piece of paper tucked into my mailbox. It was from the HOA. "Welcome to the neighborhood," it read in perfectly typed Times New Roman font, but it wasn't really a welcome, it was a warning. "Your fence height is non-compliant with community standards," it said. "Mailbox style does not match approved aesthetic guidelines." That was the first time I felt it, that cold little twist in my gut. I just moved in. No introductions, no handshakes, just a passive-aggressive checklist telling me I'd already gotten it wrong. I laughed it off at first, just overzealous management, I figured. Maybe they had a weird obsession with uniformity. Maybe someone was just trying too hard to make a good impression. I replaced the mailbox with a standard black one from Home Depot and shrugged off the fence thing. It was only 2 inches taller than their limit, and I wasn't about to rip it out over that. Still, something about the letter bothered me. Not just what it said, but how it said it, like I was already being watched, judged, controlled. Then came the second letter. This one wasn't tucked into the mailbox, it was taped to my front door. "Reminder, HOA standards are not optional." It included a photo of my backyard fence printed in black and white, circled in red ink. No signature, no contact number, just a warning. I started noticing things. A white SUV that drove by my house a little too slowly, too often. Lawn chairs slightly turned on neighboring porches, always facing my direction. I'd wave, nobody waved back. I began to wonder if I'd missed something in the fine print when I signed the papers. Some clause that said, "By living here, you surrender your autonomy to a group of strangers with clipboards." Still, I tried to stay positive. I mowed the lawn. I trimmed the hedges. I even added solar lights to the walkway, hoping it might look more compliant. But the pit in my stomach only got deeper. There was a chill beneath the perfectly manicured surface of this place, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped into something far more sinister than an overmanaged subdivision. The final straw of that first week came on a Sunday morning. I was sipping coffee on my porch when I saw someone stop in front of my house. A woman I hadn't met, standing dead still at the edge of my property, clipboard in hand. She scribbled something, looked up at my windows, and walked off without a word. I didn't know it then, but that was Karen, the queen bee of the HOA, and that clipboard wasn't just for show, it was her weapon of choice. That moment marked the end of my peace and the beginning of a war I never asked for. I thought I'd bought a dream, but what I got was a nightmare with property taxes. She introduced herself like a ghost, uninvited, unavoidable, and way too interested in things that weren't her business. It was early on a Tuesday morning. I had just stepped out to grab the paper when I noticed her again, standing at the edge of my lawn with that same damn clipboard. Same stance, same disapproving squint. I hadn't even finished my coffee. She didn't smile, didn't wave, just flipped a page on her clipboard and started scribbling. I walked up to her slowly, still half asleep. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She didn't look up, just said, "You're in violation." "Love what?" "Your flower beds. They extend past the 3-foot border limit. That's non-compliant." I blinked. "Are you serious?" She finally looked up at me. Sharp blue eyes, platinum blonde bob that didn't move, and this perfectly arched eyebrow like she was permanently unimpressed. "I don't joke about standards. You'll receive a notice." That was it, no introduction, no welcome to the neighborhood. Just "You're wrong, fix it or we'll fine you." And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't about flowers. It wasn't about fence height or mailbox aesthetics or where I put my trash cans. It was about power, control, dominance. Karen didn't just represent the HOA, she was the HOA, or at least she thought she was. I tried to be civil, I really did. "Look," I said, "I just moved in. I'm happy to learn the rules, but I'd appreciate a little grace while I settle." She smiled then, but not kindly. It was the kind of smile you give someone you've already decided to ruin. "Everyone gets the same rules. Grace leads to chaos." Then she turned and walked away like the scene was over, and I didn't matter. Over the next few days, the letters started piling up. Flower beds, fence, trash cans not pulled in within 12 hours of pickup. One even cited a disturbing decorative item on my porch. It was a wind chime, a freaking wind chime. Suddenly everything I did or didn't do was a violation. It felt like I couldn't breathe without breaking some invisible code. And Karen, she was everywhere. I saw her walking the block every morning, clipboard in hand like a suburban drill sergeant. She'd stop at random houses, jot something down, glare at a shrub or a lawn ornament, then move on like a meter made for aesthetics. The thing was, she never knocked, never talked, just observed and judged. If you didn't comply, you got a notice. If you questioned her, the fines doubled. I found out from a neighbor that she'd been on the HOA board for 8 years, president for the last 5. Uncontested every time. "They don't even hold real elections anymore," one of the neighbors whispered to me when I brought it up. "No one wants to deal with her. Most people just lay low." Lay low, that was the survival strategy. Don't draw attention. Don't question her. Don't plant the wrong flowers or paint your door the wrong shade of blue or park your car an inch too far to the left. Just disappear into the background and maybe, you'd be left alone. But that wasn't me. I've never been good at laying low, especially when someone tries to push me around. I started asking questions, polite ones at first. I emailed the HOA requesting clarification on the bylaws. No response. I left a voicemail. Nothing. So I showed up at the next board meeting. It was held in the local community center and packed with folding chairs, half of which were empty. Karen sat at the head of the table, surrounded by 3 other board members who looked more like hostages than leaders. When I asked about the fine process, Karen didn't even let me finish. "Fines are issued based on board review. If you want to dispute them, you may submit a written appeal, which will be reviewed within 60 days. Next." That was it, next, like I was some problem to be shuffled along. The other residents, those who showed up, barely made eye contact. One woman gave me a tiny nod of sympathy, but no one else said a word. That night, I stood on my porch, staring at my garden. It was beautiful. Lavender, marigolds, snapdragons, I'd planted them by hand. And yet, in Karen's world, they were non-compliant. I realized then I wasn't dealing with a neighborhood. I was dealing with a regime. And Karen? She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was feeding on the fear those rules created. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I was done being polite. She picked the wrong house, the wrong flowers, the wrong homeowner to try and intimidate. And I was just getting started. It started slowly, like a faucet drip you ignore until the ceiling caves in. The first fine came in a plain envelope, typed and sterile. $75 for non-compliant trash can placement. According to Karen and her cronies, my bins were visible from the street for more than the allowed 3 hours post-collection. I'd pulled them in after work. That was my crime. The second fine arrived 3 days later, $1.50 for unapproved exterior lighting. My porch lights were solar-powered, soft, and amber-hued. But Karen claimed they exceeded the HOA's lumen limit. That was apparently a thing. A made-up rule buried in some dusty bylaw no one actually remembered voting on. Then came the third, $100 for excessive noise disturbance. The noise, my wind chimes. I'm not kidding. Karen wrote that they were audible from the street at all hours and posed a nuisance to community tranquility. Community tranquility, from a wind chime. The next time I saw her, she was parked down the block in that same white SUV, holding her phone out the driver's window. I watched her as she filmed my house, slowly, deliberately, then drove off without acknowledging me. I stood there with my arms crossed, heart pounding, a cocktail of fury and disbelief churning in my chest. I wasn't even sure what part made me angrier, the invasion of privacy or the smugness she wore like perfume. Over the next few weeks, I saw it happen more and more. HOA board members driving past my home, sometimes twice in one day, sometimes at night. Always slow, always with phones recording. One of them, an older man named Greg, actually got out of his car once to inspect the boundary line between my yard and the community path. No notice, no permission, just him, hands behind his back, packing like a wannabe surveyor, muttering about encroachments. I told him to leave. He said, "You'll be hearing from the board." And I did. The next letter wasn't a fine. It was a notice of alleged property encroachment. According to them, a portion of my backyard fencing may overlap with land technically designated as common HOA property, based on a plat map from 1982. I read it 3 times, unable to make sense of it. There were no specifics, no measurements, just vague legal language and a veiled threat. The HOA reserves the right to pursue reclamation of said property pending further review. Reclamation. They were threatening to seize my land. I sat at my kitchen table that night, staring at the paper while my dinner went cold. Every time I thought they'd hit rock bottom, they pulled out a bigger shovel. This wasn't enforcement anymore. It was harassment. Coordinated, deliberate, relentless. I tried calling the HOA office again, straight to voicemail. I emailed the board, no reply. I sent a certified letter demanding clarification on the encroachment claim. It was signed for but never answered. The silence was deafening and calculated. Then one night I caught Karen outside my property line again. It was around 8 p.m. I was pulling weeds when I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path behind my yard. There she was, holding a flashlight and measuring tape. She didn't see me at first, but when she did, she didn't even flinch. "You're trespassing," I said, voice steady. She tilted her head, just verifying a concern, nothing personal. I stepped toward the fence. "Everything about this is personal." She smiled that same icy smile. "If you're going to live here, you should understand how we do things. Standards matter. Order matters." Then she turned and walked away. I barely slept that night. I kept wondering how far this would go. Would they tear down my fence, try to sue me, evict me? Could an HOA even do that? I didn't know then, but I would find out soon enough. Because the next morning, another letter came. This one certified in bold type. Intent to initiate legal action for property violation and unauthorized encroachment. My hands trembled as I held it. They were serious. And for the first time, I realized they might actually believe they could win. But they'd forgotten something. This was my home, my land, and they weren't the only ones who could fight dirty. It felt like someone had punched me in the chest when I opened that letter. Notice of intent to reclaim property. That's what it said, stamped in bold, legalistic font like it was trying to intimidate me just by how it looked. According to the document, the HOA was officially initiating proceedings to claim a 12-foot strip of my backyard. 12 feet. The entire back row of hedges I'd just finished landscaping. The small vegetable garden I'd built with my own hands. The space where I'd planned to build a pergola someday and maybe, just maybe, find the peace I'd worked so hard for. They said it was based on an old plat error from the early '80s. Some bureaucratic glitch, they claimed, where part of my lot line technically extended into what was now classified as common HOA green space. Never mind that my deed clearly showed the land as mine. Never mind that the previous owners had maintained it for 2 decades without issue. Suddenly it was theirs, because a misfiled document said so. I stood there in my kitchen, that letter in my hands, and for the first time since moving in, I felt real fear. Not annoyance, not frustration, fear. The kind that coils in your stomach and whispers that everything you love is about to be taken away. And as if to drive the knife in deeper, I overheard Karen later that week talking to one of the neighbors at the mailbox cluster. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. It's just that her voice, that high-pitched, sugary drawl that somehow managed to sound polite and venomous at the same time, carried like wind through a canyon. "Oh yes," she said, "we'll have that troublemaker out of here soon. It's only a matter of time." She laughed. I gripped my mail so tightly I crumpled it. I didn't even care if they saw me starring. Karen looked over her shoulder, met my eyes, and smiled like she already owned everything behind my fence. That was it. That was the moment. The moment I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just about annoying rules or petty fines. This was a full-blown power play to take my land, my peace, my home. And if I didn't fight back, really fight, I'd lose everything I'd built. But the thing is, they'd made a mistake, a huge one. They thought I was just another docile homeowner, someone who would bend, pay, and eventually break under pressure. What they didn't realize is that I don't break, I dig in. I stopped reacting, no more angry emails, no more calls that would go straight to voicemail. I went silent, let them think they'd won. Meanwhile, I started preparing. I began by pulling every document I had from closing, plat maps, surveys, purchase agreements. I spent 3 straight nights cross-referencing them, trying to find the exact boundary line they claimed I'd violated. And then something strange happened. I couldn't find anything about the supposed green space in the HOA's original incorporation files. In fact, I couldn't even find those files. So I drove to the county clerk's office the next morning and requested the subdivision's original development records. The clerk, a kind woman named Teresa, took pity on me when she saw the look on my face. "HOA trouble?" she asked. I nodded. "You have no idea." She led me to a dusty back room with rows of filing cabinets. It took 3 hours, but finally, I found something. The original plat map, dated 1981, marked with a different boundary line than the one the HOA was citing. Their version had been redrawn in 2003 by a private engineering firm hired by the HOA itself. A map that was never officially approved by the county. That was the first crack in their armor, but it wasn't the last. Back home, I started walking the neighborhood. Quietly, talking to people, I asked questions not about my case but about theirs. And wouldn't you know it, I wasn't the only one. One family got fined for using a backyard fire pit, another for improperly colored mulch. A retired veteran told me he paid over $1,000 in fines last year alone, all signed by Karen. They were all too scared to fight, but I was. The night before I made my move, I sat on my back porch staring at that hedge line they were trying to steal. I thought about all the work I'd done, the hours I spent building this life. I thought about my parents who always said, "Stand your ground even if you're the last one standing." I wasn't ready to lose this place, not to Karen, not to anyone. They wanted a war. Fine. But they had no idea who they'd picked a fight with. I stopped reacting and started planning. No more packing the house in frustration. No more pointless phone calls to voicemails that were never checked. I turned off the emotion like flipping a switch. Karen and the HOA had been playing dirty, hiding behind bureaucracy and silence. Fine. I'd beat them at their own game, with facts, law, and something they clearly hadn't expected. I knew how to dig. I started with the plat maps, every version I could find. The original one from 1981, the one I'd tracked down at the county clerk's office, became my Rosetta Stone. The lines were clear. My property stretched clean to the rear hedge, right where the previous owner said it did. The HOA's updated map from 2003? It had been drafted without proper county approval, drawn up by a private contractor with clear ties to the board. And worse, I discovered it had never been filed with the Planning Commission. They were using an unofficial document to justify land seizure. But that wasn't even the juicy part. As I dug deeper into HOA records, thanks to a neighbor who had been quietly keeping paper copies for years, I found a misfiled annexation request from 2004. It showed the HOA had tried to expand their common space and failed. The county had kicked it back due to missing signatures and incorrect lot designations. They'd buried it in a meeting summary, hoping no one would ever notice. Until I did. While I was sifting through all of that, I noticed something else, something personal. Karen's house. I pulled her property records, cross-referenced her lot with the HOA design standards she was always citing. And what do I find? Her back deck extended 5 feet into the setback zone. Her front flower beds included non-native species, specifically called out in the guidelines. Her shutters, the wrong shade of blue. It was all there, in black and white. Karen, the queen of compliance, was violating the very rules she fined me for, and no one had ever said a word. Why? Because she was untouchable. Or at least she used to be. That's when I brought in the heavy hitters. I hired a real estate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Elise who had spent 15 years dealing with nightmare HOAs across the state. I showed her everything. The fake plat map, the denied annexation, the record of harassment, the pattern of selective enforcement. Her eyes lit up like a trial attorney handed a gift-wrapped case. "I don't just think you have a defense," she said. "I think you have grounds to sue." Next, I hired a licensed surveyor. I didn't want to rely on anyone else's lines, I wanted my own. He came out with equipment and ran the property with laser precision. The final report: my fence was well within my legal lot, that 12-foot strip the HOA wanted. It was mine, documented, certified, slam dunk. With my arsenal built, I took one last step. I crafted a binder, an actual physical binder, sectioned off with tabs labeled. Legal property boundary evidence. The surveyor report. Violation of due process. Selective enforcement documentation. Karen's non-compliant property features. I included pictures, emails, certified letters, dates and timestamps of every slow-driving HOA vehicle that had passed my house. I had receipts, literally and figuratively. I made 3 copies. One for the HOA, one for the county, and one for the civil court system, just in case. Then I did something Karen never expected. I went silent. No protests, no complaints. I paid my water bill, I mowed my lawn, I acted like a model resident. But beneath the surface, the fuse was lit. I was done being the target. Now I was the trap. When the next HOA meeting rolled around, I was ready. It was held in the same bland community center as always. Fluorescent lights, metal chairs, the faint scent of old coffee and dried-out carpet glue. Only this time I didn't walk in like a desperate homeowner looking for mercy. I walked in like someone holding the matches to burn the whole rotten structure down. Karen was already seated at the front table, surrounded by her usual enablers. Clipboard in hand, lips pursed like she'd sucked on a lemon for too long. She barely glanced at me. That was her mistake. She assumed I was there to make another futile plea. I sat in the front row, opened my binder, placed it gently on the table beside me, then waited. The meeting started like all the others, minutes read, budgets skimmed, eyes glazed over. Then came the homeowner concerns portion of the agenda. Karen called my name like it was a formality, already ready to shut me down. But I didn't approach the podium. I stood. I picked up my binder and walked straight to the board table, slid it in front of her, and said calmly, "I'd like to address the board regarding the false encroachment claim on my property." She blinked, then smiled. "That issue is still under HOA legal review." I cut her off, politely but firmly. "Actually, it is, because you never had legal standing. According to the original county-approved plat map, my lot ends exactly where my fence stands. Your claim is based on a 2003 draft that was never filed or recognized by the county." I opened the binder and turned it around so she could see the highlighted documents. "You'll find the official map here, the denied annexation request from 2004 here, and a certified land survey conducted 2 weeks ago confirming that my fence does not encroach on any community property." The room got quiet. I didn't stop. "In addition," I said, flipping to the next tab, "I've compiled evidence of selective enforcement and ongoing harassment by board members. Multiple videos and photos of HOA officers recording my home without cause. An itemized list of every fine issued against me, and comparative data showing these standards were not applied equally to other homes, including—" I looked directly at Karen. "Yours." Her face froze. I pulled out photos, ones I'd taken from the public sidewalk, her oversized deck, her garden with unapproved plants, her shutters, her violations, each one carefully cited against the bylaws. I let the silence hang. Then I dropped the hammer. "As of this week, I've filed a formal complaint with the County HOA Regulatory Board for abuse of authority. And with my attorney's help, I've also filed a civil suit for harassment, defamation, and attempted property seizure based on falsified documentation." Gasps rippled through the room. I looked at the other board members, not Karen, the ones who looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. I'm not just fighting back for myself. I'm putting the entire board's actions on record, and everyone here tonight will have access to these documents. I held up a stack of handouts, summarized versions of the binder, one for every homeowner in attendance. People took them, they started reading. Heads turned. Whispers passed from one chair to the next. Karen tried to regain control, but her voice cracked when she opened her mouth. One board member, a man named Don who hadn't said a word all meeting, finally spoke. "We were told this was handled," he said. His voice was small, uncertain. "It wasn't," I replied. "You were lied to." Karen's face was sheet white. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten. I let the truth do the heavy lifting. That's the thing about paper trails, they speak louder than emotion ever can. When the meeting adjourned, no one looked at Karen. Neighbors came up to me instead, quietly, shaking my hand, thanking me. One woman leaned in and whispered, "We've all been waiting for someone to do this." Karen stood off to the side, binder still unopened, lips pressed together so tight they'd gone colorless. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to, because by then everyone knew the queen had been dethroned. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Just 2 weeks after the HOA meeting, a letter arrived, not from the board, but from their attorney. It was polite, clipped, and trembling with quiet desperation. They were formally retracting all fines levied against my property and respectfully withdrawing the encroachment claim due to updated survey documentation. They hoped we could resolve the matter without further litigation. Translation: we surrender. The same board that had hounded me with notices, fines, and legal threats now wanted to open a dialogue. But the most satisfying part wasn't what was in the letter, it was what wasn't there. Karen's name. She hadn't signed it, she hadn't even CC'd herself. I found out why the next day. A notice went out to the neighborhood. Effective immediately, Karen L. is stepping down from her role as HOA president due to personal reasons. Personal reasons. Sure, what they meant was she got caught, and now she couldn't hide behind a clipboard anymore. That same week, 2 other board members quietly resigned. The remaining ones scrambled to install temporary replacements, but the community had already seen too much. At the next meeting, more homeowners showed up than I'd ever seen, people who had never bothered to attend before. They came armed with questions, concerns, and in some cases, their own receipts. The days of rubber-stamped decisions were over. One of the interim board members approached me afterward, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. He asked if I'd consider dropping the lawsuit. I told him I'd consider it if they agreed to a few conditions. First, I wanted a full rewrite of the HOA bylaws, done publicly with homeowner oversight. No more buried rules, no more secret loopholes, and certainly no more abuse of power hidden in legal jargon. Every homeowner would get a vote. Second, I wanted a formal letter of apology, not just for me, but to the community, for years of mismanagement, overreach, and intimidation. And finally, I wanted full transparency moving forward. Every decision, every fine, every action documented and made available to the people actually living in this neighborhood. He didn't even argue. By the end of the month, everything was signed. The fines, gone, the lawsuit, withdrawn, the bylaws, under revision with a new committee of homeowners leading the charge. For the first time, we had a say. And Karen. Oh, she vanished. No goodbye, no explanation. One day she was stalking front yards with her clipboard, and the next she was a ghost. Her house went up for sale 2 months later. Rumor was she moved to Florida, or Arizona, or somewhere HOA boards still thought they were untouchable. I didn't care where she went, only that she was gone. My yard still blooming. My porch lights still glowing. My fence still standing. And peace. Finally mine. Now when I step outside in the morning, coffee in hand, I don't scan the street for slow-moving cars or clipboard-bearing tyrants. I breathe. Deeply. Fully. The birds still sing, my wind chimes still whisper, and my home finally feels like what I dreamed it would be the day I signed those papers. Mine. Completely, unapologetically mine. Neighbors wave now. Not the polite, nervous kind of wave they used to give when Karen was lurking around, but real, warm, grateful gestures. Some of them even stop to chat. A few have even said, "Thank you," unprompted, and you can hear it in their voices. It's not just about the flowers or the fence. It's about what changed underneath it all. We're not scared anymore. The HOA, it still exists, but now it works for us. Meetings are well attended, rules are proposed, discussed, voted on together. No more secret fines showing up in mailboxes, no more silent surveillance. No more power plays in polite disguise. We built something better, and we built it ourselves. Some days I catch myself walking through the backyard, through that once contested 12-foot strip and smiling. Not because of the garden or the hedges or the silence, but because I know what it took to keep it. The fight, the fear, the fire, and the choice not to back down when backing down would have been so much easier. I remember that first letter taped to my door. The first time I saw Karen's clipboard, the night I couldn't sleep, afraid I'd lose everything. And I remember the moment I realized I wasn't the problem. They were. This place, this home, feels different now. Not because it changed, but because I did. I'm not just a homeowner anymore. I'm the one who reminded this street what ownership really means. Because sometimes, the people they try to break are the ones who end up rebuilding the whole damn system. And if I learned anything from all this, it's that peace isn't something you buy with a mortgage. It's something you earn.